Why have wars gotten so much worse? Specifically, why have civilians become main targets in wars, and when did this truly start? Well, it probably has something to do with total warfare. Total wars are conflicts where both sides are willing to sacrifice everything that they have. Historian Paul K. Saint-Amour provides a more comprehensive definition. For him, total war is defined on the basis of four concepts. One, the mobilization of populations by ideological and industrial means. This leads to two, the subsequent dissolution of the difference between civilians and combatants. Three, there is a focus on an ultimate and extreme goal, usually having to do with some fundamental cultural difference. And finally, number four, he qualifies the presence of degrees of subordination within each state. According to Saint-Amour, they often act in conjunction with each other, amplifying their effects, like when public opinions of subhuman enemies lessens the restraint of civilian targeting. This definition is important in naming our first total war, but also the degree of totality of following wars and how this changes in time. There is strong evidence to suggest that the first total war, at least in America, was the Civil War. Some historians point to the First World War in the early 1900s or even the French Revolution in the late 1700s. That being said, the American Civil War introduced many of the key concepts of an unlimited war. When delving into this topic, it is easiest to talk about Sherman's march to the sea at the end of the war. Between the summer of 1864 and April of the next year, Sherman's forces tore through the South to meet General Grant in Raleigh, North Carolina. He began his journey by burning Atlanta to the ground and continued to waylay to the Confederate homeland, targeting industry for the potential benefit of the rebels, yet not actively avoiding private property and causing widespread abuse against civilians. It preceded the unconditional surrender by Confederate forces essentially as Sherman finally reached Raleigh. The march acted almost like the bombs dropped on Hiroshima or Nagasaki, in that it was one last deliberate attack on the civilians to shorten the war. Sherman believed that attacks like these would cripple the South's economy and force Confederate soldiers to come home. In his own memoirs, he says he made orders for, quote, the total destruction of the arsenal and its contents, and such public buildings as could be converted to hostile uses. Meanwhile, the right wing continued its movement toward Savannah, tearing up the track and destroying its iron. Sherman's orders say to target anything that can be used for the war, like public buildings. This most blatant abuse is essentially the beginning of the dissolution between civilian and combatant. This civic targeting, though, has principle given the South's mobilization. Sherman recounted a newspaper from his travels between Atlanta and Savannah containing a message from P.G.T. Beauregard, a CS officer, wherein he wrote, quote, every citizen with his gun and every Negro with his spade and axe can do the work of a soldier. You can destroy the enemy by retarding his march. This rhetoric is reminiscent of war-bound posters during the World Wars. Certainly, Sherman had reason to fear Southern folk on his journey. This behavior makes sense to Saint-Amour. He reasons that increased civilian mobilization is not a trait of the well-developed nations in such conflicts. Instead, the opposite tends to be true. This makes sense as the North could rely on their far superior industry for which the South needed to compensate for in civilian output. This manifests itself in a story from J.B. Kendrick, a pastor in South Carolina at the time of Sherman's march. Quote, several citizens gathered about the courthouse were watching a group of Union soldiers' movements, and at last one of them, whose patriotic zeal far outran his prudence, went to the spot where one of the soldiers was standing, and, drawing a pistol, was about to fire. The soldier saw what was up, and, springing from his horse, got the drop upon the citizen, and fatally shot them in the abdomen. This suicidal devotion of even non-combatants is vaguely similar to Japanese soldiers during the Second World War. These traits are uncharacteristic of any previous war. I want to change course to talking about the Second World War, though not before addressing the numerous technological and strategic concepts that emerged as a result of its predecessor. The quickly firing rifled cannon gave veterans shell shock, while the machine gun enabled the killing of hundreds by just the few. However, the airplane was certainly the most important innovation. Though mostly used as reconnaissance in World War I, their development further meant more destruction to civilians. As these countries experienced unfamiliar territory in such a conflict, they looked to the past for help with logistics and economic planning. Military observers use the American Civil War as a reference point. The unbridled targeting of civilians became main stage in the Second World War. The world's failure to fix the problems from World War I left an open Pandora's box of new advanced weaponry entering the modern age. The airplane was a newfound source of power in combat. Now, they wouldn't just fly over enemies to find them, they would fly over cities to bombard them. Saint-Amour thinks of this act of aerial bombardment as a pinnacle of total war, as it was such a devastating and direct attack. Quote, this inherent futurity aligned total war's temporality with that of aerial bombardment, a rapidly developing technique whose power to terrorize during the First World War had seemed to offer foreglimpses of a far more terrible future, and whose psychological power lay principally in its coercive, panic-laden structure of anticipation. In the same bubble is the nuclear bomb. In each unit of mass, there is energy equal to the speed of light squared. Light moves very fast. Thus, there is a lot of energy in very little mass. By accessing only a small amount of this, we can create a reaction that levels cities instantly. In their two military uses at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they killed over 100,000 people just from the blast. The U.S. needed an unconditional surrender from a military cult leader. In any other scenario, American and British forces would likely be killed by the thousands in an attempt to get ashore of Japan and face what World War II historian James Bradley calls, quote, a suicide defense force from everywhere. According to Winston Churchill, quote, the decision whether or not to use the atomic bomb to complete the surrender of Japan was never an issue. There was unanimous, automatic, unquestioned agreement. Nor did I ever hear the suggestion that we should do otherwise. However absolute the last two developments were, nothing compared to the mobilization, specifically of the ideologies of the Japanese people. When the military took over the government of Japan, it became obsessed in trying to form itself into an empire. To accomplish such a task, they needed a strong class of soldiers. According to Bradley, the government used rhetoric in the Bushido or the samurai code to create crazed warriors out of ordinary men. Death before dishonor became death before surrender. Japanese soldiers infamously never waved the white flag, making fighting in the Pacific just that much more difficult. Nearing the end of the month-long Battle of Iwo Jima, such an incident occurred. Donald Howell, a Marine, was outside a cave being torched by a flamethrower. He spotted soldiers running out of it. Having a long and tough experience with these kinds of men, he shot them immediately. Quote, they were just piling up. I was shooting them as fast as they came through. Marines were sometimes duped into taking prisoners. When they laid down their arms to take the Japanese as prisoners, the Japanese would kill them. There's also a fair degree of ideological molding of American soldiers in the war as well. Historian Thomas E. Rogers compares the soldiers in this conflict to ones in the Civil War. He says that at their core, Civil War soldiers need not be motivated by anything. They had sufficient desire to fight for what they thought was their right of self-governance. Opposingly, though some Americans would have liked to have thought that they were fighting for something like this, they were truly fighting for the system. By the end of boot camp, the men were so depleted of their individuality that they fit into whichever battalion or specialization they were given. They fought for their buddies, of whom they had bonded with because of shared experience. This mechanization is very characteristic of total war, as it involves ideological shifts and a few pinches of subordination. The Second World War, on its surface, looks very alien to the old-timey Civil War. However, campaigns in Europe closely resemble Sherman's March, if not in tactics, then in principle and in resistance. What is said frequently of history is that it repeats itself. But in truth, it grows on itself, just like World War II grew on the Civil War. St. Amour describes this growth as an asymptote, or a graph approaching infinity. We are currently moving upwards at a rate faster than ever before. Every day we are progressing, making the world a better place, but at the same time, making a more potentially deadly one. So, what comes next?
Шар превращается в колоссальный светящийся купол. Яркое свечение еще продолжается. В этом опыте оно длится необычайно долго.